Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics. This is a show where I discuss the political news of the day and I provide my analysis so that you can understand. This is a bit of an informal episode, not something that I normally do, but I kind of wanted to take a break from the schedule. I'm not sure if this is going to be a regular episode or if this is going to be uploaded later in the week, but obviously, but I wanted to record this and then have it in my back pocket to upload when I was ready. As you can see from the title, we're going to talk about the potential policies that a Trump or Harris administration could implement in the future. So let's start with President Trump. Now, President Trump was already president before, obviously, that's why we call him President Trump or former President Trump. I do anticipate some things to be different in another Trump term than what we saw in the beginning, and I'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. So first, let's talk about America First. That was one of his big things when he was president in the late 2010s. So I anticipate we're going to see more NATO skepticism and a reluctance to work with European allies and as well as our Canadian and other allies as well. However, I think it would be unlikely that troops will be pulled because that one that didn't happen when he was president the first time, and two, he would I don't think he would want to cut the defense budget, which was what would have to happen if we were going to pull troops there. That would be the only thing that would make sense. Otherwise, where would the rest of the money go? And that's pretty unlikely. I don't think the defense budget is really ever going to be cut. Then, going on from America First, we have more trade wars, especially with China. That was a huge thing when he was first president. It's hard to say. I am not an expert in economics. Those trade wars, it seemed to have gone well. Nothing bad seemed to have happened. But then again, that's not my area of expertise. And I would expect more isolating Iran more when Trump is if and when Trump is president again. In Israel, I would expect more closer ties to Israel than we already have, even with Biden. Like, and one great example of his when he was first president was when he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem that in 2018, I believe. That was a huge, big deal. People were pissed about that. That was, or people in the Arab world were pissed about that anyway. Israel was obviously very happy about it. I'm not exactly sure why that's a problem. I think it's because Jerusalem, at least part of it, is contested between Palestine and um, Israel. Now, immigration. That's the next thing I have on here. That is Trump's big thing. We haven't heard much about the wall really this campaign. I would anticipate that's going to come back. He's also talked about ending birthright citizenship. He flirted with it at the beginning of his when he was first a politician, but I wouldn't think that's going to happen. And the big reason for that is because that's in the 14th Amendment. So we would need a constitutional amendment to end birthright citizenship. So that's going to be a big difficulty. I did hear though at one time in the not too distant past where Trump said we were just going to reinterpret the law, and that's the problem with the law is you can always reinterpret it. So I don't know how you're going to reinterpret the 14th Amendment, but that's what they might try to do. Of course, we're going to see more deportations. That's pretty much a given, and there's going to be less asylum claims because Trump has said himself we're going to start the largest mass deportation effort in American history, and that's basically a given. But even then, though, there's not a whole lot of details about what he's going to do going forward. And then domestic, of course, he's a Republican, so cutting regulations is going to be a huge thing. He's definitely going to be repealing the green energy subsidies, which is very bizarre because Elon Musk is a big supporter of him, and Elon Musk is, a great green energy guy. However, I'll propose a reason why Elon Musk probably supports Donald Trump is because when Biden did some of his green new no, not Green New Deal, but when he did some of his green policies there there was a provision in there that said that it had to be the tax credit for electric vehicles could only be for companies that had unionized labor forces, and Tesla does not have a unionized labor force. So that might be why he is supporting Trump instead of Biden, or I guess instead of Harris. But anyway, it's a very odd alliance. Politics does bring odd alliances, if you ask me. And of course, I'd expect more land to be opened up for drilling. And then domestically repealing and replacing Obamacare, that was a big part of the first, or was supposed to be a big part of the first Trump administration. That didn't end up happening. If you haven't ever seen the dramatic video of John McCain putting the thumbs down, rejecting the GOP plan, to replace the healthcare plan. It's definitely worth watching. It's quite dramatic. However, as Trump said during the debate, he has concepts of a plan, so I don't know what that's going to look like. If I was him, I would learn the lessons from the first administration and I wouldn't touch Obamacare. Next is judicial appointments. There's no doubt there's going to be a whole bunch of judicial appointments, maybe even to the Supreme Court. I wouldn't be surprised if Samuel Alito and or Clarence Thomas retires in the next 4 years if there is a Trump presidency. If there's the Harris presidency, they're going to hold on a little bit longer for sure. But there's almost certain to be a GOP Senate, as I've talked about in previous episodes. I'm not going to re-explain why here. A GOP Senate, which, if you don't know, the Senate approves judicial appointments as well as cabinet appointments, meaning there's going to be a whole bunch of new judges for sure that are going to be approved. And Trump's going to get even more judges on the bench than the 300 he already got when he was president the first time. Economics, talked about this a little bit earlier. Tax cuts, of course, that's a huge thing. He's proposing trillions of dollars in tax cuts over the next 10 years. And then tariffs, that's his other thing. He wants a 20% tariff on everything coming into the United States, as well as a 60% tariff on anything coming in from China. Still don't know how he's going to do that because that's going to cause massive inflation, and I don't think that's going to go through Congress. I think that's more just trying to play politics, like to appeal to populism. And then infrastructure, Trump might try to do some infrastructure stuff. Infrastructure week was kind of a running joke during the first Trump presidency because like every time Trump would say, "Oh, it's going to be infrastructure week," he would like cut himself off and talk about something else or like some scandal will emerge or he would bring it up whenever he wanted to distract people from something that was going on. If there is infrastructure, I would expect something similar to what President Biden has done the last 4 years with the American Rescue Plan. Well, not quite the American Rescue Plan, but with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, would expect something similar to that in the future. Then this might be perhaps the scariest of all, at least for people who aren't Trump fans, is a potential purge of the federal government, meaning the firing of tens of thousands of civil servants, as well as expanding the power of the executive branch. You can see a little bit of that in Project 2025. But then again, Project 2025, as I've talked about before, is not a Trump endorsed platform. It's just something from the Heritage Foundation. Although some of his people do have connections to the Heritage Foundation. The cultural wars, Trump doesn't really play much into the social conservative that much. He didn't really do that quite as much as when he was president. He didn't play that as much as George Bush did. George Bush loved to play into the cultural war, specifically with gay marriage. And I would expect Trump to roll back transgender rights. I think transgender people are probably going to be banned again from the military. Obama allowed it, Trump banned it, Biden re-allowed it, and then would ban it again for sure. Then there's going to be some new Department of Education orders against teaching critical race theory for sure. And I don't think that would need to go through Congress. That could just be done by um, through the executive branch. And then I would throw in there Biden has changed Title IX trans to allow sports, female men or transgender women who are men into women's sports. That would come to an end almost immediately for sure. And he's going to play into Law and Order. That was a big thing in 2020. And then kind of ending, those are some big things. Kind of ending is Congress. How would he relate with Congress? Well, if it's a Democratic Congress, there's going to be a lot of tension for sure. There might even be a third impeachment of Donald Trump, which would be silly, and I don't think that would be a good idea because one, it wouldn't pass, and two, there's no danger of Trump like being reelected again. So like this would be his last term. If Trump is elected president, he would almost immediately be a lame duck. And that would probably prevent him from doing a lot of the things that he would want to do. And of course, I would expect a government shutdown at least once during a Trump presidency, especially if there's a Democratic Congress. If there's a GOP Congress, at least for the first 2 years, I would expect it to be relatively peaceful between the two sides. We'll have to wait and see if that's what ends up happening. But I would expect Congress and the White House, if there's a GOP Congress, to be there would be a lot less friction. There's still gonna be some because I think a lot of congressional Republicans aren't all that into Trump, but I think they're still gonna it's pretty obvious it's gonna be a lot better than it would be if it was a Democrat. The last thing I'll mention here is, well, two more things, is I would expect Trump to be closer to Russia and North Korea during a presidency like he was in the first during the first administration, and he would move away from our allies in Europe and North America, which I'll have to admit, it does concern me. And overall, I would expect a more assertive and confrontational agenda in the second Trump term, perhaps even more confrontational than the first time around. Now let's move on to Kamala Harris. So here's some of the things she may prioritize in the presidency. Well, we as with Trump, we don't really know a lot of details. It's because this has really been a vibe campaign from both sides rather than a policy-based campaign, which has really been like that for a long time. So Kamala Harris, I would expect her to focus a lot on social justice, particularly in places like criminal justice reform, maybe legalizing marijuana, voting rights, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I would expect that to be a big priority of her, as well as equality legislation on race, gender, and sexual orientation. Maybe there'll be healthcare reform by lowering prescription drugs. There's definitely going to be some things with climate change and the EPA. Maybe there'll be Green New Deal like policies on electric vehicles and pushing renewable energy. I would expect things like that to remain about the same as it has done under the Biden administration. And we would remain in the Paris Climate Accord. And I would think we will probably send money to foreign countries as well as places in our country that are affected by climate change. And economically, there's definitely going to be tax increases on the wealthy. There might be a workers' rights bill as well as paid family leave. Although, as I'll talk about later, she's going to have trouble getting that through Congress. Immigration reform, there could be she was definitely going to prioritize a pathway to citizenship, and she will probably U-turn on the Trump era restrictions that Biden has kept in place on some of the asylum orders. I would expect a similar handling, maybe even a little bit worse, from her than Biden. And lastly, on foreign policy, well, not lastly, but almost lastly, on foreign policy, NATO, she's going to be a strong supporter of NATO, and she's going to remain competitive but diplomatic approach to China, and she will prioritize human rights and democracy while battling authoritarianism. Not saying Trump wouldn't necessarily do some of those things, like remain competitive but diplomatic to China, but I think Trump would be a little bit more aggressive than Kamala Harris would be. That may be good, that may be bad. I'll leave that up to you. Of course, she's going to prioritize abortion rights. She's going to regulate big tech, which is something that I'm surprised I would figure Trump would focus on as well. And then she's going to try to implement gun control as well as, I would think, an assault weapons ban. She might have said she's not going to do that, but I would think that she would still try. However, as I said earlier, with the GOP in control of the Senate, it is almost certain that most of this stuff will not get done. As I will talk about later, if it looks like the GOP will still take control of the Senate, then I would expect a very stymied Kamala Harris. She's not going to be able to do as much as, for example, Biden did in his first 2 years, Trump in his first 2 years, Obama in his first 2 years, blah, blah, blah. She's not going to be able to get quite as much done. Her cabinet is probably not going to be approved nearly as quickly as we would want because the GOP Senate is going to be a bottleneck. And she's going to struggle with the judicial appointments. And if there's a vacancy within the first 2 years, which I don't think is going to happen, then I would think that with the GOP controlled Senate, they're probably not going to block her. I don't think they're going to wait 4 whole years, but I think they are going to make it much more difficult. If she wants to put a more person that's more on the left, they might force her to pick a centrist. Anyway, that is some of the big stuff I want you to think about. This is not a video quite like or a podcast quite like the other ones. I kind of wanted people to think, kind of a chat and informal, some things to think about as you're casting your vote, as I'm casting my vote, some priorities. Well, of course, we'll know in the future, in just a few weeks, or maybe less, depending on when I upload this, what as a recording it is still mid-October, but we will know in the coming weeks what direction we're going to be heading in. And perhaps after the election, once more is known, once we know the situation with the Congress and once we know who the president is, then I'll be able to make a more in-depth video. But for now, I think this is the best we can do, and I think that's all right. So I want to thank you for tuning in. I will see you soon, and have a great one. Bye-bye.